Hey everyone. So in this video, I'm going to go over the PowerPoint on research getting started. And it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. How to get started on your research paper and move through the research process all the way up to sort of drafting the rough draft, right? We've spent the first couple weeks reviewing basic essay writing skills, making sure we remember what a good introductory paragraph does and that it includes a strong thesis statement, how to create fully developed, well-organized body paragraphs, and then how to have a strong concluding paragraph as well. Those are elements that you need to have in your essay, no matter what type of paper you're writing. But we are focusing on research papers specifically in this course. So starting this week and over the next few weeks, we are going to really narrow in on how to do that type of paper successfully. You still have to make sure that you have all of those basic essay elements. You still need an introductory paragraph and thesis statement. You still need well-organized body paragraphs. You still need a concluding paragraph. So don't forget any of that information from the first couple weeks. But we do need to sort of shift gears and start looking at how to do research papers. So that's what we're focusing on today. So I'm going to share the PowerPoint here. All right. Let me get back up here to the beginning. I'm just doing it. So, from planning research to evaluating sources, that's pretty much what we're going to look at today. Our first slide shows a flowchart of the research process. You can kind of see it's color-coded. So it seems like there are 4 different stages to the research process. We have the getting started stage, the planning your research stage, conducting research stage, and organizing and drafting stage. So the getting started stage up here in blue, you have already done some of this. Review the assignment, make sure you know what's expected of you. Think about your resources that are available to you, not your sources per se, the resources available to you. Do you have good internet access? Do you have either a library you can physically go to or an online library? Do you have databases? You do through the school. What about time? Time is a resource. So think about your resources. Choose a subject. That's kind of already happened. You were given 8 to choose from, and you had to do that back in project part 1 in week 1. Listing and clustering your ideas and opinions about your topic, you already did that in project part 1 as well. The free write and answering questions. Conducting preliminary research over here. You may or may not have already done this yet. If you haven't, it might be a good idea to just, take a little bit of time. This is really more just like gathering general ideas, general information about your topic. Going to Wikipedia, just, browsing various websites just to see what's out there about your topic. Say for instance that you chose the topic on the pros and cons of taking a gap year. Maybe you're not entirely sure exactly what a gap year is. So, maybe you do a little bit of research on that just to make sure you understand what it is you're actually writing about. And again, some of you may have already done that when you were choosing your topic back in project part 1. But if you haven't, just take, 30 minutes or so, just see what's out there. Next comes planning your research. All right, planning the research, not actually doing it yet, planning it. Make sure you have a narrowed topic. Even though most of the topics on that list in project part 1 were somewhat focused and narrowed for you, there's still room to focus even more. So start thinking about that and continue thinking about it as you start your research. Form a research question or a working thesis. We just reviewed what a thesis statement is, and in project part 2 next week when it's assigned, you're going to be asked to come up with your working thesis. Develop a research plan When are you going to do this research? And select keyword searching terms, the terms that you're going to enter in a search bar to try to find potential sources for your topic. We're going to look at pretty much certainly developing the research plan and searching for the terms we're going to look at in this PowerPoint. Conducting your research, this is where you're actually going to start looking for potential sources. Might be primary research, might be secondary research. We're going to talk about both of those today as well. That column down the middle right here, as you're doing your research, make sure you take careful notes. It says to reflect in your research journal, but I'm sure you probably won't have an actual research journal. It's more just, have a notepad, use the notes section of your phone, whatever, to jot down your ideas, to jot down questions that you come up with about your topic, just anything related to this research project, because you're not actually sitting down and typing anything yet. So you need a way to keep track of your thoughts as you're doing your research. It's actually really useful. It does not have to be anything formal though. Says next, create and add to a working bibliography. We're going to talk about that. Evaluate and take notes from sources. We're going to talk about that today. Summarize, paraphrase, and quoting your sources. We're going to talk a little bit about that today, but we actually focus on it more in a couple of other lessons over the next couple weeks. And then the last stage, organizing and drafting. We're not really going to talk about that today. That rough draft is still a few weeks out, so we're going to get to that. I believe in week 5, we start talking about drafting the paper. All right, so we're kind of focusing on a little bit up here in the blue, a little bit in the peachy colored area, and a good bit here in the green. So let's get started. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the rhetorical situation, which we reviewed in week 1. Always have that rhetorical situation in the back of your mind the whole time you're working on this project. Make sure you're super clear about what your topic is, because you're going to narrow in even more from the topic that you chose from the list. Think about your angle. It is especially important when you're writing a research paper to present something that is a little different, a little more unique, a different perspective on your topic, because these are all topics that have been written about numerous times already. So how is yours going to be different? You don't want it to sound like you're just regurgitating things that other people have already said. That's not the purpose of a research paper. You want to approach it in a unique way, in some way. Keep coming back to what your purpose is. Your purpose in writing this research paper is not because you have to or because it's an assignment. Why did you choose this topic? What do you hope to accomplish with the research paper? Let's just pretend that you were going to publish it. What would you hope would come from that? What are you hoping to get across to the readers? Who are your readers? Who is your audience? I think you can safely say that your audience is not just me, but like your classmates as well. So how are you going to relate to them in some way? How are you going to make them connect with your topic? That also means you can assume a certain level of basic knowledge and expertise, so you don't have to sort of dumb anything down. You can assume that your readers are on the same level as you, right? Your voice. This is a tricky one because APA format does not allow for personal pronoun usage. So you can't refer to yourself in the paper. There's no I, me, myself. The only time you're really able to do that is if you're using personal experience to help support a main point in a specific section of the essay. But even then, using it in a personal pronoun way is still kind of dicey. So if you can't refer to yourself, how do you make sure you are there in the essay? You have to balance that, the formal nature of APA format, with your personality. You don't want it to sound like a robot. You don't want your writing to sound too stuffy and formal, but at the same time, it can't be too casual. So as you're doing research, as you're thinking about what you want to say on your topic, you need to make sure that you're finding that balance between formal enough, but not so formal and stuffy that we've lost you, that we can't hear your voice and personality. All right, so keep the rhetorical situation in the back of your head at every step along the way. That first section in blue on the flow chart was all about, getting started. We're talking about sort of getting focused here. You have kind of already done this, but just keep in mind that there's still room to narrow in even more on a lot of those topics that were on the list. Next week, when project part 2 is assigned, you will be asked to come up with a working thesis. Think about what we just reviewed about thesis statements. Right now when project part 2 gets here, your thesis might not be as focused and specific as a good thesis statement is supposed to be, like we learned and reviewed last week and the week before. But you still need something, even if it's more general, more vague right now. You still need a statement that is sort of going to be the driving force behind your research and your plan for the essay. As you do the research, as you sort of decide on your main points and what you're actually going to include in the essay, you can come back and refine and revise that thesis statement. But just start thinking about it now, because next week you're going to need to come up with a working thesis. Once you get out of that, as you're moving out of the getting started phase, you do want to start thinking about doing the research on the topic. And I put this slide here because even though we're not doing the research yet, I wanted to point out the 3 types of sources that you can use: primary sources, secondary sources, and tertiary sources. They're listed and named this way because primary is obviously sort of like the best type of source, and then secondary, and then tertiary. We're going to talk more about primary and secondary, but tertiary sources, these are the types of sources where you can get that general background information to sort of get you started thinking about your topic. Magazines, Wikipedia, just general websites that may or may not be credible. These are not necessarily the types of sources that you're going to include in the essay, right? But they're a good place to start. What you're going to want to include in the essay are primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are, it's firsthand information, straight from the horse's mouth. These are observations, interviews, surveys, experiments, documents, artifacts. For you guys, it's probably going to be more like interviews and surveys. And you don't have to have a primary source used in the essay. But given the types of topics that you had to choose from, there is a really good chance that you might know someone, either maybe an instructor or someone you work with, or maybe a family member who's in the healthcare field. You might actually know someone that you can interview who has a certain level of experience and expertise on your topic. You could maybe do surveys, survey your classmates. You're all in the same boat. Survey your coworkers if you want. It can be really useful information, especially if you can get that interview. Surveys, Sometimes they yield interesting and useful information. Sometimes they don't. um, and it kind of depends on the questions you ask and who you give the surveys to and that sort of thing. So that is something to start thinking about. Most of you, though, you're going to spend the majority of your time here with secondary sources. Articles from databases, journals, credible websites, organizational websites, government websites. This is where most of your time is going to be spent. But if you can think of any primary sources, it might be interesting to use at least one. My suggestion, though, would be if you are thinking you might do an interview or do a survey, still find an adequate number of secondary sources for your paper, because you never know what might happen up here. That interview might fall through. Those surveys, they might not give them back. It might just be a lot of really crazy information coming at you, and we are on a time frame. None of us have a whole lot of extra time to spend, and it might just be that the surveys don't go as well as you had hoped. So you want to make sure you have those secondary sources in case the primary sources fall through, right? As you're starting to think about what types of sources you're going to be using, you want to start developing a plan. You know, where are you going to do your background research? Are you going to do any primary research like the interviews or surveys? Are you going to do any library research? This is obviously, I mean, you could physically go to a library. More than likely, though, it would be sort of like an online library. Databases, the school offers some. And then just regular internet research. Where do you sort of see yourself focusing? And if you're thinking all internet, think about the primary sources and the library research. See if there's any way you can look into those as well, because you want a good mix of different types of sources. But then the most important step on this slide is getting organized to do the research. What are your priorities? If you're going to do an interview or a survey, you got to figure out when that's going to happen, and you need to set it up soon, right? Because again, if it falls through, you want to be prepared. You want to have time to sort of overcome that setback. When are you going to do this research? When are, set aside time, come up with a schedule. Even if you can't stick to it all the time, if you at least, sit down with a calendar and say, okay, I'm going to try to do 2 hours of research on this day. I'm going to try to do another hour on this day. I'm going to try to, if I'm doing a survey, I'm going to have the survey questions listed. I'm going to have them typed up by this day. I'm going to give them to the people on this day. I'm going to collect them on this day, right? And stick to it as much as you can. But even if you do have to, give and take along the way, having it set out for yourself, having that visual plan can help alleviate a lot of the anxiety that comes along with doing a research paper. Because if you don't have that tentative schedule, you can feel like you're just out in the middle of the ocean drowning, because it's very overwhelming, and we're all so busy. So just even trying to just parcel out some time every once in a while on that calendar, and trying to stick to it as much as you can. It really, even if I think it's more psychological than anything. Yeah, obviously, if you stick to it, that means the work is getting done, in a timely fashion, and you're not going to be rushing at the end, and feeling even more pressure and anxiety. So sure, it definitely helps in actually getting the work done. But I think it almost is more psychological as well. Like, the benefits in that respect are worth it. Try creating a tentative schedule for yourself, right? Once you've sort of taken care of those steps, come back and start thinking about the different resources for information that are available to you. Think about those personal resources, right? People that are in your life, people you know. Think about any type of reference works that might be available on your topic, books. I mean, it's possible you might have access to textbooks that would touch on your topic, perhaps. Periodicals like journal articles and news sources. The one I really want to look at right here is this one, audiovisual, digital, and multimedia resources. I don't know if a lot of students realize how much is available that's not traditional print, whether we mean physical print or online print. So audiovisual, digital, and multimedia resources, we're talking about resources that you either see or hear. So TV shows, news shows, documentaries, podcasts, TED Talks, YouTube videos, credible YouTube videos. Those can be used as sources. It, doesn't have to be in written form for it to be a credible source. There are plenty of documentaries out there. There are plenty of TED Talks, plenty of credible YouTube videos, a lot of really crappy YouTube videos as well, but plenty of credible YouTube videos that have good information. And there's a way to cite them. There's a way to do a reference entry for them. So think outside the box and think of how you can incorporate all these different types of information resources. And sometimes it's even better for you to think of those non-traditional resources because they're a little more engaging, So don't rule them out, for sure. See what's out there, right? Once you're ready to start actually looking for your sources, the next step is finding an effective and efficient way to search sources and to sift through potential sources. This is one step in the process that a lot of students get hung up on. And I think people in general, in daily life, because so many of us, we use search engines all the time in our daily lives, or in our professional lives even. So we're constantly doing keyword searches. And if you aren't thinking carefully about the words you're using, you can spend a lot of unnecessary time sifting through search results that seem completely out of left field and have nothing to do with the topic you're really trying to find. And that can be frustrating and defeating. It can just take the wind right out of your sails, and you may have a topic that you were really excited about researching, really felt a connection to, but when you got to that point of trying to find your sources, it just completely derails it. And then this thing that you were somewhat excited about, maybe not the actual writing part, but the topic, and it's like, then you're not even excited about it anymore. And it can really put people behind, because then you're going to keep procrastinating. You're going to keep putting it off because you're like, oh my God, I cannot sit there and look through, list after list of search results that just aren't working. So we have some tricks and tips for you, right? These are called Boolean operators. All right, the first tip. I think is probably the most useful. Phrases and single quotation marks, not double quotation marks, but single quotation marks. So let's say you have a phrase that, or a term that's more than one word, and you're wanting to search that to help find sources on your topic. The best way to get the type of results you're looking for is to put that phrase in single quotation marks. So the example here is space dogs. I don't know what space dogs are or why we're looking for information on them, but we are. So typing in, let's just use Google as an example. Typing into the search bar on Google, space dogs with single quotation marks, the results that you're going to get are web pages that have that phrase. It like exactly, space dogs. Not just pages that have space or dogs, maybe both, and maybe space in one section and dogs in another section. No, it's going to give you web pages that contain the exact phrase, space dogs. That's super helpful. The next tip is using the word and in all caps. So if we typed in space and dogs, that would give us results where the web page will have the word space and the word dogs and the phrase space dogs. So this might be used if you have an exact phrase, but you also know that this topic might get talked about or written about in a way where that only one of the terms might get, only one of the words might get referred to from time to time, right? So this is going to give you results that have both words alone and then the phrase exactly as well. You could use or, again, all caps. So space or dogs, that's going to give you web pages that contain the word space or the word dogs or both, but not necessarily next to each other, like space dogs. So this, you kind of have to think about why might you use that operator or. And again, it's really more like, might this topic be discussed in a way where the exact phrase isn't always used? It's really just important terms that can be discussed together or separately. The word or will get you those types of results. The word not in all caps. So, for instance, if we typed dog not Chihuahua, that's going to give us web pages that contain the word dog, but not the word Chihuahua. So this helps filter out. So let's say, let's see. Okay, let's say you're doing the topic on music therapy. Let's say you've been doing some research and a lot of what you're finding is talking about how music therapy is used for people on the autism spectrum. And you already have a good bit of information about that particular use for music therapy. And you're like, okay, there's got to be more. There's got to be something else. Like, I want to know what else music therapy is used for. So you can type in music therapy, not autism. And that way it's going to filter out all those other potential sites that you don't need that information. You're looking for something in addition to that, right? The word near in all caps, that's going to give you, whatever words you type in, those words are found in the website with me, separated by maybe 10 to 25 words. So this is if you know that like the topic that you're looking up, these two words, it's not an exact phrase necessarily, but you're looking for them in, in relationship to each other. So you're hoping to find that there's sources out there that talk about, you know, gap years and resumes. They're not, those words are not going to show up as an exact phrase, so you're not going to use the single quotes. But if you put it near, right, then those two words will be found near each other in those web pages. That can be helpful. The sixth tip is using parentheses. And I don't know that any of you will get to this complicated of a search. But, if you do, basically, you can type in space or dogs, not parenthesis, poodle or chihuahua. So that's going to give you search results where the web pages have the word space or the word dog or both space dogs, but do not have the words poodle or chihuahua. So again, it's just filtering, right? It's telling that search engine a little bit more about the type of results you're hoping to find. Use them to your advantage. If you tend to do pretty well Googling things and finding what you want pretty easily on the internet, you might not need to use these Boolean operators. If you tend to struggle, though, come back to these. Or you don't even have to come back to this PowerPoint. You can just Google Boolean operators and you will probably find tons of resources, and you can just print something out, or, like it's not that unusual of a request, to look up Boolean operators. But just remember, they're there to help you, and they can help you save time and endless amounts of frustration and anger if you start struggling to find good sources and search results especially. All right. Okay, moving on. As you start going through those search results or any other type of information resource you're using, whether maybe you're looking at YouTube videos or podcasts or TED Talks, whatever type of source it is, you want to engage and evaluate your sources. All right. You have already started to engage with your topic with what you did in project part 1, but you want to engage with the source material as well. All right, so let's take a look here. One way to engage with your sources, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to test each source to see if it's even worth reading. So part of engaging with your source happens before you even start reading the whole thing or watching the whole thing. How closely is this source related to your topic? Is the source too basic? Is it too complex? Again, you can assume that the people, your audience, are people on the same level as you. So you don't need to use sources that are really geared more towards like elementary or high school kids, right? But you also don't want source material that clearly is written by and for people that are like way up there in the, with multiple degrees and talking, in very technical scientific terms that, unless you can bring that down to our level a little bit, but even just trying to get through those types of sources can be tedious. So looking for sources that are kind of just right. Always think about how that source could add to your balance of source material. Because again, yes, you can use YouTube videos, but you don't want to use nothing but YouTube videos. So you want a wide variety of different types of sources. So let's say you already have 2 or 3 YouTube videos you're thinking about using, and then you come across a 4th one. You have to ask yourself, okay, I already have quite a few YouTube videos. I don't really need any more. So should I even bother to watch this one? Maybe I go ahead and watch it, and if it turns out to be really, really good, maybe I go back to the 3 I already found, and maybe I can replace one of those with this new one. Just think about that. Think about the variety of sources you're using before you invest in a potential source. Skim the potential source. If it's written, skim the source. If it has an abstract, read it. If it doesn't have an abstract, read the first paragraph or so. Just, get a feel for what that source is going to be focusing on. Get a feel for the style. Get a feel for whether or not it might not be such a credible source, right? If it seems like it's a good source to use, keep track of any, good information that's in it, like look at, especially if they have like cutouts, or something, like look at information that seems to be highlighted in some way. Use that information. Use anything you know about the author to figure out if this is a source worth investing in. Because if you just keep reading every potential source you come across, watching, listening to every potential one you come across in full, that's a lot of time. And also very frustrating because only a few of them are actually going to pan out and be what you want to use in the essay. So don't waste so much time investing in every single potential source. Come up with a way of looking it over, taking just a quick glance, quick overview, and seeing if there's anything that can help you figure out beforehand if this source is probably not going to be a good one. Probably not what you're looking for. Move on, right? Once you have a source that you think really could be a potential source, you want to read it, listen to it, watch it, and you want to do so in an engaged way. Read with an open mind, but not an empty mind. Think about what the purpose of that source is. What is that author trying to achieve? Who is the audience for that source? Is there anything in it that is really well said, well written, explained really well? Is there anything in it that's confusing? Is there any, contradictory evidence or thoughts? How does it relate to your working thesis that you have, the information that's in this source? Record your reactions. And, if you have any questions about something that is in the source, write that question down. If you feel like, wow, that was a really awesome point that was made, write that down. Think about and keep track of, make a written note of how you think you're going to use that source. If you're reading through it and you finish and you're like, wow, this was great, I'm totally going to use this in my essay. How are you going to use it in your essay? What is your plan for that source? How do you see that source fitting into your essay? Keep track of it. Write it down somewhere, okay? Also, use potential sources to look for leads to other potential sources. Almost everyone's going to have some sort of reference, area. So use that to maybe look at what sources they used for their information, right? All right. We're going to kind of skip that slide on reading. As you're looking at these potential sources, you need to also evaluate them. So, first things first is kind of engaging with the source and deciding if it's even worth reading all the way. If you decide it is worth reading all the way through, while you're reading and after you finish reading, you have to evaluate that source. Is it a credible author? Is it a reliable publication or a reliable website? Is the discussion, is the information as unbiased as possible? Or is it clear that they were trying to push one way or the other? It's not to say that every single source has to be completely unbiased, but if there is bias, you need to be aware of it, and you need to make sure that if you use information from that source, that you make the reader aware of that source's bias as well. Is the information current? Try to stick within the last few years. Especially things in healthcare and sciences and things like that. New information is coming along all the time, so you want information that is up to date. Is the information accurate to the best of your knowledge? If you are, reading through sources and, they're contradicting each other, you need to look into that, right? Does the source offer full logical support for whatever ideas they're including? Make sure that it's not just a cursory, general discussion of your topic. You want more meat to your sources than that. Is the writing, and if it's a website, is the design of good quality? If the writing skills are poor, or if the website looks like a mess, you need to further investigate that source to see if it's credible. Think about where this information is coming from, who's putting it out there, and why. And is it accurate information? Is it well-supported information? Or is it just random fluff by a random person? You need to consider these things, right? Okay, moving on. As you're going through your sources, once you have decided on the sources that you're actually going to sort of read and engage with all the way through, you need a way of keeping track of those sources and the information that you're finding in the sources. Because first, you have to give credit to any source that you borrowed information or words from. No, just every time. So you want to make sure that you keep track of all of your sources so that you can do that correctly. You know exactly, let's say you are using 5 sources. You have kept track of them and you know exactly what each of those 5 sources is, how to find them, how to get back to them. You have all the information you need to create a reference entry and a citation. You have kept track of what information you're using from each source. You have to do this in order to properly write the paper. So choose a way to keep track of all of this stuff. I always say either a notebook or have a document, a file on your device that's devoted just to gathering sources and source information. Keep track of everything. The author's name, the title, the website, everything. One way you can really make sure you do this is to do what's called an annotated bibliography. So for every source that you have decided to actually read thoroughly or watch thoroughly, because you have already tested it and you have decided, no, this really could be a good potential source. So I'm going to go all in on it and see if it gives me anything good. Make a reference entry for that source. Write it down in your notebook, that reference entry. Type it up in that document that's on your device. We're going to talk about how to do reference entries next week. Okay. But create the reference entry. And then underneath that entry, jot down a couple sentences that summarizes that source. What was that source all about again? That way you can remember. You have this list to come back to. Be like, oh yeah, that's the source that talked about blah, blah, blah. So a couple sentences that summarizes the overall main idea of that source. And then a couple sentences that explain how you planned on using that source. That way you don't forget. Like, you know, you come back to this list and you're like, okay, yeah, I remember that source. I remember reading it. I remember that's what it was about. I have no idea why I thought I was going to use it though. If you jot that down too, then you won't forget. So you're reading this source and you're like, oh, this might be a really good source to use in my second main point. Jot that down. Remind yourself. If you, while you're reading the source the first time, if you can already identify any key passages or, you know, sections that you're like, yes, I am going to use this specific information in some way, jot that down too under the reference entry. Anything you can write down to help you remember what that source is, why you wanted to use it, and what parts you wanted to use. It's going to make the process of drafting the paper so much easier, right? None of this has to be formal. You just, you know, I mean, if you're able to do the reference entry, that's formal. But nothing else needs to be. Just jot stuff down to remind yourself. So useful. Now, you might end up with 7 sources on that list. And when it comes time to actually do the essay, let's say there's like 2 or 3 of those sources that you eventually decided, nah, I'm not using them. I'm going in a different direction. I kind of changed tracks a little bit. So it turns out I'm actually not going to use these 3 sources. Then just forget about those 3 sources. And when it comes time to do your reference page for the research paper, you just use the ones that you already, that you ended up using in the essay. But you already have the reference entry done. Just copy and paste that onto the reference page. You're good to go. It can save you so much time and frustration to keep track of this information. It's only going to help you. So give it a shot. See how it helps, if it helps. See how it helps ease some of that anxiety. See how it helps, if it helps you feel more confident in what you're going to be writing and how you're going to be using your sources. Right? All right. Kind of already talked about this. It's the note-taking strategies. I kind of include it with the annotated bibliography. You know, if you're going to have a section where you write down the reference entry for a source, jot down all of your information there. Take all your notes there. That's how I feel it. So you found your sources, you have tested them and sifted through, whittled it down to a certain number that you're actually going to read or watch and engage with. You have kept track of those sources, made a reference entry, and jotted down some annotations to remind yourself how you want to use that source. When it comes time to actually draft the paper, there are 3 ways you can use your sources. When you're looking at your source, though, and you're like, I think I'm going to use this information right here, ask yourself, is it relevant to your working thesis, that bit of information in that source? How important or strong is that information right there in the source? Is it unique or memorable in some way? Is that bit of information worth including in your essay? Don't include information from a source just because you're required to use sources. Find sources and use specific material from those sources that actually make sense and have a purpose in the essay. Not just for the heck of it, not for fluff, not to have a citation to have your butt covered in terms of how many sources you're required to have. Use them with purpose. Be thoughtful about it. If you feel like that specific information is worthy of making an appearance in your essay, you then have to think about how you're going to incorporate that information. Are you going to provide a summary? A summary is taking a longer bit of information and kind of whittling it down to just the overall main idea. So you could take a 3-page article, and that article is going to cover a lot of main points with a lot of specific details. Your summary, though, is only going to express what the overall general idea was. So it's going to be a lot shorter. You're going to summarize a 3-page article with 1 paragraph, maybe 2. Because all you're going to talk about in your summary is just those main ideas, not the specific examples or specific details. Those do not belong in a summary. If you choose to use a summary for one of your sources, it has to be totally in your own words. I always tell students, if you want to summarize that source, you need to put that source to the side for a moment and totally on your own, write a paragraph that summarizes it without looking at the specific words that are being used in the source. Because if you're looking at the source while you're trying to do the summary, it's too likely that that same wording is going to show up in your summary. Also, if you can put the source to the side and summarize it in your own words, that means you have truly understood the information in that source. So it's also a good test, right? Because if you don't fully understand what the source is saying, you have no business using it in the paper. So think about that. If you use a summary, you must provide a citation every time. You might also paraphrase from your source. This is where you take sort of a shorter passage, maybe a paragraph or a section of a paragraph, and you're going to put it in your own words. You have to make sure that you do not, that your version does not resemble the original version in any way. You're going to express the same idea, but in a totally new and different way. Check the paraphrase against the original, make sure that you captured it correctly, right? Always provide a citation, part in parentheses. Most of your source use should come from paraphrases. But many students think that the majority of their source use should come here in the third way, which is direct quotes, taking something word for word. That's not true. The only time you want to use direct quotes is if the information is perfectly worded as it is, or is a very complex idea that you're then going to explain. But just know that use quotes sparingly. Most of your source information should come from paraphrasing, which is 100% your own version of the original source material. It should look nothing or sound nothing like the original. So as you're going through your sources and you're thinking about how you're going to use it in the essay, what specific parts of that source you're going to use in your essay, also start thinking about, would this be better as summarized information Is there anything in this that really should be quoted word for word? But I want to do that sparingly. What information am I paraphrasing? We're going to look more at how to do that in week 5, but it's something you want to start thinking about now. Okay. In the next lesson today, we're going to talk about plagiarism more specifically, but as part of the research process, what everything we've talked about with, especially finding sources, engaging with your sources, evaluating your sources, and keeping track of the material that you want to use from your sources. It's important to know that you need to practice ethical research. Do the research and write the paper yourself. Don't fudge or twist facts. Treat source material fairly. Make sure that you have that accurate working bibliography where you are keeping track of every single source that you have read or watched in full. That you're taking good notes, and if you are transcribing any information, like if you make that reference entry for the source and you're like, a few sentences to summarize the source, a few sentences on how you planned on using the source, and then let's say that there was a 2-sentence direct quote that you really thought you might use, and you jot that down in your notes. Make sure it's clear to yourself that that was exactly what the direct quote was, because you don't want to make any mistakes when you then start drafting the paper. You want to be able to rely on the accuracy of your own notes so that you don't accidentally commit plagiarism. Take your time. Also, just to be clear, you have to treat websites, anything off the internet, just like you would a print source. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean you get to copy and paste things. You still have to treat every source fairly, respectfully, and accurately. When you're dealing with internet sources and you're doing that working bibliography, creating reference entries, you need to make sure that you have recorded the full URL for that website. I'm actually going to share something else with you here just so you know what I'm talking about. There we go. So let's say that, I'm here on nurse.org. Let's say that I was doing a research paper and I used information from this article right here on Johnson & Johnson versus Pfizer versus Moderna vaccines, right? This is an internet source. So as part of my reference entry, I have to include the URL. That does not mean that I put https://nurse.org. It means I put this whole URL. The URL that you put in the reference entry has to take me to that exact page on the internet, not the overall website that the article is found on, but the exact location of that article. So again, keep that in mind as you're keeping track of your sources. Be accurate. All right, so the next lesson, again, is focusing more on plagiarism, exactly what it is, how to avoid it, other ways that you can sort of misuse or mistreat your source material. Super important lesson. Right now, though, you should start moving through the stages of the research project flowchart that you haven't covered yet. You need to start thinking about your sources. Next week, week 4, project part 2 is assigned to you. And when that's assigned, you're going to have to have come up with a working thesis, but you're also going to have to list potential sources. So if you haven't already started looking for sources, you should start now, just to give yourself a little bit extra time on it. Also next week, in week 4, we are going to look more specifically at APA format, how to do reference entries, how to do citations. So don't worry so much about that as you're starting to look for sources. Just keep track of all the information you need for any potential sources you happen to find over the next week. Okay? All right, if you have any questions or, run into any problems if you do start looking for sources, reach out, otherwise you're free to go ahead and move on to the next